Hi, everyone. This is Maddi. Cheers. Welcome back to Radical Democracy. If you have joined us before and if you're just joining us, thank you for listening in. You can listen to us on the TuneIn app, or you can get us on Strong Island Radio on Facebook. And also, we do have call-in during the show, so if you would like to call us at 516-945-9099. So today, as promised last week, and for those of you that didn't listen last week, don't worry about it. We're going to catch you up. We are still on the Great Law of Peace, and we are talking about how this is wisdom governance. This is a type of governing, a type of democracy that is actually divinely inspired, but it is unnecessary for those of you who are looking for a way to reform and restructure our democracy, or who are looking into the problems that we are having in our current democracy. This is a guideline that I think can get us to where we need to be. And it's not like it hasn't been tried before. So like we mentioned last week, this particular form of democracy, guided by the Great Law of Peace and those instructions, is a form that has been with the Haudenosaunee people for well over 1,000 years. And some people even say 2,000 years. And of course, is the foundation of the United States Constitution. Both Benjamin Franklin and his son and Thomas Jefferson spent a lot of time with the Haudenosaunee, and the entire structure of our government is based on theirs. So we are going to get into those differences tonight. We want to finish up the story of the peacemaker's journey, and I want to say too that this is our interpretation. We've spent a lot of time, my husband Bob Vetter and I, a lot of time with the Haudenosaunee, with Kay Olin and Tom Porter in particular, both of whom will be on in the new year to give us even more detail about how this is for them in practice. And also, this particular version that we're doing is very, very shortened. I can't remember if I mentioned last week or not, but it takes 10 days to tell the entire Great Law of Peace. But we do want to get into the government part of it today so that we can apply it. So what we went over last week was the 3 original instructions. We started with that, with this belief that all human beings, when first put here, were given these instructions about how to make good choices, how to live with each other, that we should be grateful for what we have and not worried about what we don't have, that we should respect each other and all of nature and treat each other and all of nature with respect and kindness, and that we should live in clans, those groups of related families where we trace the lineage through our mother so that our children can be born healthy, but also so that our men and boys can be raised in a community and in a home where women are respected and given authority, and who can treat them with kindness and respect also. So that circle, that sacred reciprocity is continued within the way everything functions within a longhouse and within the village itself. So then we went on to talk about how we lost contact with our 3 original instructions, how that loss of gratitude leads you to greed and jealousy, and how greed and jealousy lead you to unkindness and disrespect in the form of war, the ultimate form of disrespect and unkindness, and how that can lead you to the destruction of families, and how they lost the clan system over a period of time through laziness, through not being willing to take the time to be grateful, to do the ceremonies that kept the community together. And that led to the dark and troubled times, which we call war. But actually, what I love in the description of the dark and troubled times is that they use the word insanity. Their word for war does not mean a bunch of people fighting. It means insanity. And that's a term I think we should adopt when we're speaking of war also. We also talked about using the good mind and the quick mind, about how when you're using that grateful, respectful, kind, loving mind, your choices are good. You are connected to the Creator, or if you prefer, to all creativity. You are connected to that energy and that spirit. But when you are using that mind that wants everything right now, which is a spot that we are in, it is a big dilemma for us. We are being trained through technology to think that everything should happen right now. Our children are being trained, unless parents, and there are many of them who are actively trying to give balance to that idea that everything should happen right now. So when you are using that quick mind, that I want it now mind, then we get ourselves in trouble. That's when we go to war. That's when the jealousies happen. That's when the stealing happens. That's when the idea that it's not fair happens. Those people have more than me. So we talked about that. We talked about the descent into those dark and troubled times, about how it was such a sad and miserable time for everyone, and there seemed no end in sight until a child was born, a very special child who's had a very special gift. And we also talked about how the Haudenosaunee believe that all of us are born with a special gift inside. It's our talent, it's our interest, it's whatever makes us spark into life. So that special gift is what we're supposed to give to the world, and we cannot give it if someone doesn't respect us, if people aren't kind to us, if we don't have a family base, a community base of a loving, kind, and respectful people around us. So for those people who get caught up in that, they realize that they lose ground. And for the peacemaker, whose special gift was obviously peace, his mother and his grandmother, so he wouldn't lose ground, so he wouldn't be taken into war, went and raised him outside of where all the wars were happening, out in the woods, where he could learn from them, where he could also learn from nature. There are so many lessons for us as human beings, and American Indians teach us that nature is our oldest teacher. It is our oldest grandparent, so to speak. And because we don't spend enough time in nature lately, I think we're finding ourselves in this same situation where we're not slowing down and we're not learning from nature. And we talked about how, because the peacemaker could learn from the women in his life, and because he could learn from nature, he grew up with great respect for women and nature at a time when men had no respect for either one. And how he was able to see things in a different way and come up with Gana Lagoa, the great good, or what we commonly call the great law of peace. He went on to try to teach this to people at age 13 and met up with a woman called Jugunsase, who we talked about how she was a businesswoman. We talked about the different aspects of her and about how possibly civilization for them at that time had descended to a point where she might even have been the owner of a brothel. And even though there is no history of prostitution in all of Native America, one of the points that could be made by this descent is that that is how bad things had gotten, that they were actually using women to get what they wanted. And in any case, whether you believe that happened after the influence of Christianity or it happened because of how badly things had devolved, how much things had fallen apart, it is still a very strong message that she had gone to a place of darkness, that she had actually, as described, she had been a person who had started this journey of trying to give comfort to the men at war, trying to give comfort to the people who were wounded in the wars, that she had gone into a place of greed where she was really realizing that, oh, she could make money off of this, and had descended into the darker elements of femininity, the gossiping in order to keep the wars going. But how when she got to meet the peacemaker who did treat her with respect and who did have this message of peace, this message of peace brought her back to herself. It brought her back to the woman she had once been, and it brought her so strongly to a place of wanting to bring peace to others so that others could share in her wealth, so that others could share in the beauty of her village and her life. And this place that she gets to where she wants to teach peace to everyone that she meets makes her the mother of all the nations, which is how Jugunsase is known to this day, and she does. She goes on to become the first helper of the peacemaker, the first one to teach how peace should be and how we can achieve peace through this plan of the Great Law of Peace. And so she does that. She does that in her village as men come to her for food and for medicine. She sits with them. She talks to them about the Great Law of Peace in the hopes that they will bring this message back to their villages. And that is about as far as we got, though I do think it's really important when we're looking at today to talk about and continue on this idea of the dark and the light, that we have to recognize, and that, like I said last week, the beauty of the Great Law of Peace is its honesty, is it is so honest about how they went into war. And it's not talking about the conquerors. It's not talking about it from the position of who won the war, which is how we talk about our history. It is telling the truth about what really happens in war and what happens to the people who are conquered, and the sorrow and the grieving and the horrible life that is led by people who are constantly at war. And so it talks about very clearly how to get out of that, but it also speaks to how do we all descend into that darkness. We mentioned last week that it has a personal story. It has a personal connection to each of us, which we'll explore more as we continue on with the Great Law of Peace in the new year. We'll explore how the teachings can speak to each of us individually about conquering our darker impulses and bringing ourselves into the light. So we start that teaching in the Great Law of Peace with Jugunsase and her meeting with the peacemaker, and it continues on now with the second great helper, peace teacher, to go along with the peacemaker, and that is a man known as Iowanta. Iowanta was an Onondaga war chief who, depending on which version of the story you listen to, he either came to the idea of peace himself and wanted to teach peace and changed another theme of the Great Law of Peace that we can all change. He changed and started teaching peace among his people and was actually changing some minds. Or some say he went and met Jugunsase, heard the Great Law of Peace, and then took it back to his village. But either way, he becomes the second helper to the peacemaker and very, very influential and very important. So for this, I am going to ask my husband, Bob, to join in and to talk to us about Iowanta and his teachings and how his personality and his ability to speak made such a great difference.
I'm going to back up just for a moment,
Sure.
if you don't mind,
Sure.
to the story of Jugunsase and how this sets up a lot of what's going to come. And that is that this part of the story, the part of the story from the dark and troubled times through meeting Jugunsase, points out what I think is the dark and the light side of the masculine and the feminine aspect of humanity. Because men have their strengths and have their weaknesses, and so do women.
Absolutely.
So for the men, it's when we follow along the story, in the times when they were following their instructions, the strength of the men lay in the fact that they were the providers for the family. They were the ones who went out and left the village. So they were the traders.
Yep.
They were the hunters. They weren't in need of being warriors at that time because the people were living in peace. So their efforts mostly went into creating laws, as we said. They were
Yep.
the statesmen. They were the spokespeople. And they led from a sense of inner strength
Yep.
rather than the necessity for outer strength.
Yep.
Then when we find the dark and troubled times, it's the flip side of masculine energy, which is what? Which is the quick mind. It's being motivated by anger,
Yes.
rage, and revenge. So that's when that inner fortitude of a man turns into the outer expression of it, which is cruelty, violence, anger and hatred.
Absolutely.
And then on the side of the women are the nurturers. So when we find them living in balance, what are the women doing? The women are the ones who are taking care of everyone. They're within the longhouse, making sure that things are balanced and living in a good way there. The women are watching over the children.
Yep.
The women are observing the children to find leadership qualities, find the gifts that these children have.
Yep.
They're taking care of everyone. And then the dark side of that feminine aspect we find in Jigansase, at least in one part of the story, where she is given over to gossiping. She uses her power to encourage more anger among the men. She uses her sexuality
Yep.
to influence them. So there's the dark side of women, that they can use their sexuality over men.
Exactly. And I think, again, we're getting back to the beauty of the honesty of the great law of peace, is this is something that we seem to be avoiding discussing today. And that I think it's very, very important to discuss these things, to discuss that we all have that ability to be dark or light. We all have it. And that we all have within us both masculine and feminine energies and attributes. So however you assign those energies and those attributes, you have to be honest about who you are and what they are. And the reason the women could so effectively run those villages when they were in charge of the villages and the men were away was because of this mutual respect that occurred, because everything was in balance. And I think when you look at the highest levels of masculine and feminine, you find that they are working together, that there is a oneness that happens when they are working together. And I think that one of the issues that a lot of women are having, my guest next week will speak to this, Morgan Jamie Dunbar, but a lot of the issues that we as women are having, and one of the reasons I started the Women's Oneness Project, is because we seem to want to polarize, and we seem to want to almost get into catfights with women that we disagree with, rather than sit down and find that room for agreement, rather than do what we are naturally good at, which is that networking. And that's another thing that is spoken to in the Great Law of Peace and among the Haudenosaunee, is that we are the support of everything. That's why the strawberry represents us, because it networks underground, and that we, without that strength, without that networking, without that safe space that we can create, everything can fall apart. So going too far to either the dark side of femininity or the dark side of masculinity is going to destroy everything anyway. And I think that, too, what is really great in the Great Law of Peace is that idea that strength does not come from physical abuse. It does not come from being able to take revenge. And we'll speak to that a little more later. But thank you for bringing that up again.
But so what it points to also is free will, is choice,
Yes.
personal responsibility in every moment.
Thank you.
That we always have choices in how we're going to act in the world.
Absolutely. That is extremely important to the Great Law of Peace. That one of the beauties of the way this government is structured, as we'll find out, is that we, the people, have to take tremendous responsibility for what we are doing. We're starting to remember again that we do have power in the government, but it's very important that we don't rest on our laurels, like we've talked about before, that we see, we do have power. We can vote our way for change, for whatever change we see, but to remain as we'll talk about later, with their 9-party system, to remain in a 2-party system, as at least as far as I see it, sets us up for an us and them situation. It sets us up also to be lazy. We just, whatever, we talked about that last week, I believe, also, about whatever that my party says to do, just vote for my party, as opposed to really believing in your own power enough to say, hey, I need to tell my party what to do. I need to tell those leaders what to do. And I think that without that 2-party system, we are much more likely to be able to do that. But I digress.
Getting back to the story. So we left off with the journey of the peacemaker who continued from the village in central New York where he met Jigansase. He continued in his journey to the east, where eventually he runs into a man by the name of Iowanta. Now, in the version of the story that I'm going to tell, Iowanta, by the time they met, was in a deep, deep state of mourning. He had been a very influential member within his community and had introduced the idea of peace to a people who clearly didn't want peace at the time.
Right.
They had a leader, Tadadaho, who is described as an evil sorcerer,
Right.
who had snakes coming out of his head, who had skin like a reptile, who had bony protrusions.
Right.
So he's described as this wicked character, and he certainly is wicked in what he did to Iowanta, because Iowanta had a wife and 7 daughters. And he was concerned about the fact that Iowanta was starting to get some influence within the community. And some people were saying, yeah, maybe it is a good idea for us to try to live in peace instead of war. But Tadadaho got his power, his political power, through force, through the idea of violence, through warfare. So he had a vested interest in making sure that there was no peace and that the warriors continued to be riled up against their enemies, because as long as they had a common enemy and he was the leader, he was able to maintain that amount of leverage within the community. So in order to keep Iowanta from having that influence, the first thing that he did was he poisoned the wife and 7 daughters of Iowanta. And they mysteriously died one after another after another. And at that time, there was a belief among their people that if a string of bad things happened to somebody, that everybody else would abandon them because you'd be worried that the same thing was going to happen to you.
Right.
It was like a black cloud followed somebody.
Right.
And that is somehow contagious to everybody else. So by the time all of that happened, Iowanta was so distraught that he lost the will to live. So he stopped eating food, he stopped drinking water, and he stopped sleeping. And he was described as wandering around aimlessly, half alive. Now, another parallel event that leads up to this is that both the peacemaker and Iowanta had been independently finding pieces of shell, and they didn't know why they were finding them everywhere. But they took these little tubular pieces of shell, and each one of them had been placing them into a deerskin pouch with the idea that someday they would figure out what they were for. So Iowanta had his on his person, and the peacemaker had his on his person. So when the peacemaker was making his way along this trail, he stumbled upon Iowanta literally laying on the ground, half dead. So he was muttering to himself, and he was saying, if I ever found somebody as miserable as me, I would do everything within my power to try to bring him back to life, to try to give him the motivation to want to live again. And they say that this idea was the germ of a ceremony, so called the condolence ceremony that we'll talk about in a moment. So the peacemaker heard everything that Iowanta was saying, and all of a sudden had the inspiration to figure out what this meant. and he took the beads that he had made out of shell and put them together with the ones that Iowanta had and strung them together and held them in his hand. And these beads have a sacred power to them. And while he was holding them, he did the first condolence ceremony to soothe the feelings of Iowanta and to bring back his will to live.
And I think that's very important to note, because one of the things that we find now that we know from studying people is that before you can get over the anger, before you can get over the rage, you have to be able to grieve. You have to go and figure out a way to get past that pain. And we all know people who never do get past that pain, and it damages them for good. It damages nations for good. And when you have leaders that are effectively saying that peace is going to make you weak, peace is going to make it so that we will never have power. We're supposed to be the ones in charge. We're supposed to take over the world. And I think that the story of Tedadaho and his greed for power, his greed wasn't like Jugunsase talking about that materialistic sort of greed that she overcame. But his greed was for running the world. He wanted to be in charge of everything, and this was never going to happen if his guys decided that they wanted peace, that they were tired of fighting. So we play that game now, where we try to make somebody who's trying to tell us the truth or bring us peace or bring us together, we try to make them look as if they're crazy. We try to make them look as if, they're going to compromise, as if compromise is some sort of weakness, as if forgiveness is some sort of weakness, when in reality, and I can't remember the Gandhi quote exactly, but Gandhi said many times that forgiveness is part of real power, that only the strong can forgive. It's not the weak. It's not the purview of the weak to forgive. So that really what appears to be strength is not. And that brings us to where we are even today, in that a lot of things are depending on appearance. We are in a time where we are judging people based on just what they look like on the outside, as opposed to going deeper. And that's a place that we're going to need to get to. That's where our personal responsibility and our personal choice is going to have to come into play, because we have to stop that. If we are ever going to get to a place where we can bring peace to this country and peace to the world in general, we are going to have to stop listening to the words of those who would make us weak. And we're going to have to start being able to identify ourselves what those words are. I often think, though we're not going to get into this story today, we probably will, previews of coming attractions with Kay Olin, but the Cornhusk doll story where she loses her face. She not only loses her face, she loses, with losing her face, the ability to speak. So these no-face dolls and these no-face figures are a way of warning us that it's someone's actions, not just their words. People can tell you anything, as we all know, but that it's their actions that we have to look to, not just what's coming out of their mouths. And I think that the story of Iowanta and Tadadaho and the Peacemaker, and ultimately that change, all speaks to that too.
And one other aspect of that story that I find fascinating that we can pull out, even though I'm telling it a little bit out of sequence, that ceremony that the Peacemaker performed for Iowanta eventually became the ceremony that they used whenever one of their leaders would die. But more importantly to our wider discussion, is that ceremony also became integrated in the way that they allowed others into their village. Because in the old days, before a delegation of members of another village or another tribe or nation could come into their village, they would meet them some ways away from the village, and they would stop along the way before they ever got to their village, and they would perform this condolence ceremony. And they would find out from these visitors which ones among them had lost a family member within the last cycle of 1 year. And before they would take them into the village, they had to condole their losses.
Exactly.
And that made the difference between peace and chaos when you brought those people into your village. The idea that you want someone coming into your village with a peaceful, calm, and balanced mind as opposed to anger and hatred.
Exactly. And also because if you are grieving and you are angry and you are hateful because of that grief, or even if you are simply grieving, you are very easily influenced. So if you want to relate to any dictator that has ever lived or ever gotten power, you can see that they look for that personality. They look for that person that's in that weakened condition. They look for that person that's feeling victimized. And that's who they go after. And if you can do that effectively enough, if you've got too many people like that, that haven't been dealt with the kindness that there is in the condolence ceremony, with the patience that there is, with the love that there is in that condolence ceremony, then you're in trouble because those people can easily be influenced to create the chaos that leads to war.
So the two motivations, to get back to the story, the two motivations for Iowanta to join the peacemaker are, number one, knowing that the mission of the peacemaker was the same as his, and number two was the fact that the peacemaker, out of this great compassion, was able to bring back Iowanta's will to live.
Yes.
So for both of those reasons, he became the spokesperson for the peacemaker, who they say had a speech impediment and wasn't the clear communicator that Iowanta was.
Which I always find interesting when they say he spoke as if he had 2 rows of teeth, that he was a stutterer, that it did require patience to listen to him directly. Mm-hmm. So I think that's fascinating that he was required to have a team. So you get that idea of teamwork and you get that idea of patience when you're looking at the peacemaker, and you don't really find that in any of the other great wisdom teachers. They're always very articulate, very powerful individuals, and I mean, as well they should be, but they are very singular. The interesting thing about the peacemaker is not only is he speaking to how we all have to work together for peace, but he is just, his personage is in a place where he needs a team to communicate this. He needs other people helping him. And that's humility, the ability to ask for help. And that, I think, the peacemaker, more than any other figure you can come across as a great teacher, as a great spiritual teacher, really embodies that idea that you must be humble. That humility is where you must start, that your leaders have to have that sense of humility.
What a nice idea that would be for us.
Yes, wouldn't it be? But we'll talk about that leadership thing in just a moment, because I also, since you mentioned revenge, I also want to go into that story. They say that as the peacemaker and Iowanta traveled to try and convince people to live in peace, there was a particular story that they told. So that this story, they say, maybe influenced people to stop fighting, along with being completely war-weary. But the peacemaker felt like he had to get people to understand what was going on and what would happen as a result of this seeking revenge. So they say that he told the story, or perhaps Iowanta had to tell it for him, of this little boy who was walking down a road one day, and he was walking and walking. He was getting kind of hot, and he looked and he saw that there was a big hill, and there was a lot of shade there by the hill. So he decided he would just lay down in the shade and rest before he went back to his village. And just as he was falling asleep, he heard this huge racket on the other side of the hill, like ground cracking. He saw stones being tossed in the air. He was really frightened, but he was also very curious. So he climbed up to the top of the hill to see what was going on. and he saw an amazing sight. He saw a giant bullfrog being swallowed by a giant black snake. And the bullfrog was trying to get away from the snake, and he's ripping up the ground around him. And the snake's tail is thrashing back and forth, knocking over trees, destroying everything near him. And finally, the boy says to the bullfrog, "Look, bullfrog, I'm way too small to help you, but why don't you do to the snake what the snake is doing to you?" Sure enough, the snake goes, "Great idea." Turns around, swallows the tail of the snake, the bullfrog does. And the bullfrog's swallowing the snake, and the snake is swallowing the bullfrog, and the bullfrog's swallowing the snake, and the snake is swallowing the bullfrog, and the snake's swallowing the bullfrog swallowing the snake, until poof, they both disappear. And then the peacemaker said to the people, "That is what will happen to you. If you continue down this path of revenge, you will destroy the world around you, and there will be nothing left for your children. And then eventually the world will go back to the plants and the animals again." And they say that that is the story that started people's mind changing. And it's, to me, such a beautiful story because it is so simple and it is so clear that is precisely what will happen to all of us if we continue down any path of revenge. And I maintain any path of just simply refusing to listen and compromise. As long as we keep using the idea that compromise is a weakness, we will destroy the world around us, and there will be nothing left for our children.
Exactly. So now the two of them, Iowanta and the Peacemaker, make their journey from the east all the way to the west. And along the way, they convince the Mohawk Nation first, then the Oneida, but they skip the Onondaga. So the Onondaga are still being ruled by Tadadaho.
Right.
They go on to get the chiefs, the leaders from the Cayuga and the Seneca to join them, and then backtrack, make their way back to Onondaga. Now, Onondaga is still being ruled by Tadadaho. And they say that the Peacemaker used his power for the good to comb out the snakes from Tadadaho's hair, to turn him into a human being from the beast that he was. And they eventually are able to convince him to join, but only if his people have a little more power in one way than everybody else. Mm-hmm. They end up being the seat of the government, which they are to this day.
Right.
And their leader to this day is still referred to as Tadadaho.
Which is so wonderful because this is a story of Iowanta forgiving Tadadaho for murdering his family. This is a story of a man who has changed completely, who has just become a proponent of peace and who is healed. He's healed by the Peacemaker. He's healed by the message of peace. And whether you take this literally, as our Haudenosaunee friends do, that this history happened exactly the way we're telling you and exactly the way they'll tell you when they come on in January, that the lessons of the story and this message of change and forgiveness and community and responsibility for your own choices and your own people, not just you. It's not just about you. It's about the community at large and the importance of the clan, that these teachings are teachings we really need to hear right now. This message is essential to us right now.
And toward that goal of understanding community, the Peacemaker, when he had the representatives of the nations present, asked one of their chiefs to come forward and handed him an arrow and said, "Let me see you break that arrow." And the man took the arrow in his hands and, using almost no strength at all, snapped the arrow in two. And the Peacemaker announced to the people gathered, "Right now, each one of you individual nations is like that single arrow. Your enemies perceive you as weak, and for that reason, if they attack you, you'll have to rally your force, you'll have to kill simply to defend yourselves." Then he took a bundle of 5 arrows and some deer skin and tied the 5 arrows into this bundle and passed them back to the same chief and said, "Let me see you break the bundle now." And the man took it in his hands, and using all of his strength, he wasn't able to break it. And the peacemaker said, when you come together as 5 nations, you'll have the combined strength of all of those nations together. And for that reason, your enemies will perceive you as strong and leave you alone. So that your togetherness, your union together will be the
Absolutely.
key to being able to live in peace.
Right. And that is something we need to be reminded of in this country today. Our union, our more perfect union, is what we need to be working towards. And you are not going to get everything that you want. That is why compromise is important, and we cannot have a union without intelligent compromise, without thoughtful compromise, without patience. So that when we look at the structure of their government, we have the Onondaga, who essentially serve the role of the president, except instead of 1, they have 14. Even though their leader is Tedadaho, he has no more power than anybody else. And then we have the older brothers, the Mohawks and the Senecas. They are similar to the House of Representatives. New laws are given to the Mohawks. They're the they help and they decide, they prioritize laws. The older brothers are similar to the Senate, but mostly it's the idea that you have these 2 houses of lawmakers. And nowadays, of course, since the 1720s, the Tuscarora have sat with the younger brothers. So you have the 2 bodies that are responsible for creating law, and what you have is men making laws, but only women choosing the men who make the laws. And the women are the clan mothers leading the villages, but it more has to do with how we are choosing these leaders. And also the reason why the women were given this responsibility. And I think, again, we can talk about the women in the Haudenosaunee and related to what we're talking about with those higher levels of feminine energy. The reason that the women were given this responsibility is that during the time of war, most of them were the ones who were suffering the losses of their children, who their eyes were always filled with water because they were crying for the loss of their children, for the loss of their villages, for the loss of their families. So the peacemaker gave them the responsibility of choosing the leaders, but also the responsibility of choosing leaders based only on character, so that this would never happen again. And again, if you're looking at the strengths of femininity, you're looking at that networking, you're looking at that balance, you're looking at a mother's love, a grandmother's love, you're looking at that nurturing element. And so when we're working with our highest calling, our highest selves, our decision-making is very different, and it is for the benefit of all the people, not just the ones we agree with. So the great thing about the way this government is set up, in the actual way it was originally set up and still functions to this day, is you can take from these teachings and look at how we can do this today. Look at how could we do this, because it astounds me that most people don't seem to realize we can make constitutional amendments. We can change what we're doing. If we decide we want 3 presidents, we can have 3 presidents. If we decide that's more reasonable, if we decide that we should have 9 clans, like each one of those clans, snipe, eel, bear, turtle, hawk, deer, beaver, heron, and wolf clans, were their own political parties. Within each nation, they are sending those representatives, and each clan always sends more than one. So we are looking at a structure similar to our government, but with some major differences. Consensus is probably the hardest one for us to imagine, no majority rule. So that whether it's the women choosing the men and women who will run things, or whether it's the men making a law, there has to be consensus.
And one of the ways that they are able to gain consensus is that when a leader speaks, nobody else speaks. Imagine what that would be like for us.
Yes.
One person speaks, and when that person, and they are amazing spokespeople.
That's right.
It's built within their tradition to think deeply, to consider 7 generations, as we discussed last week, that all decisions should be based on this idea of considering what our actions today will cause 7 generations from now.
Right, and then working with the wisdom of the 7 generations that came before. That's why this is a wisdom form of government.
Then, after that leader is done speaking, there's supposed to be a pause of about 15 minutes so that when he reflects back on what he said, he can think of anything that he might have left out and have the time and the space to be able to add that to it before the next person speaks.
Exactly, and then it gives the next speaker also time to pause and reflect. Did this speaker touch on anything I need to touch on? Did this speaker, do I disagree, and how would I solve where my disagreement is? So it's taking the time to really consider, instead of these like soundbite tweets that we get from all of our leaders. And the tweets are designed basically to keep them in power. And again, going back to that two-party system is really great for keeping people in power who want power, but it's really terrible for giving power back to the people. So when you divide things up further, when you get to those layers of loyalty where you're looking at your family, your community, and then you go from your, as they describe the community, the clan, they have their rules. They have their own government. And then you go to the government of the nations, and they have their own government. And then you go to the government of the United Nations. But they are united, and this theme of unity is throughout all spiritualities. It is throughout all philosophies, whether they're atheistic philosophies or not. You know that. You're the philosophy guy. So I mean, the teaching that we have to be united, we have to be patient, we have to listen to each other, whether we agree or disagree. And before we disagree, we are not coming from a place of grief. We are not coming from a place of anger or rage or hurt. We are coming from a place of peace within ourselves. If you have that 15-minute break before you're allowed to speak to make sure that the previous speaker is done, to see if there's anything else he needs or she needs to say, and then you pass the wampum, and then the next speaker goes, it's obviously going to be a much more considerate and a much more intelligent response.
And the good mind is built into the entire way of discourse.
Exactly.
So if the good mind is to consider what the possible outcome is, to consider the consequences of your words and your deeds, by giving the person this space, that 15 minutes, and everybody else that 15 minutes to ponder, reflect, you're encouraging the good mind in every part of what you do, which of course leads to the ability to compromise. Because if you think about it, when you talked about a tweet being a soundbite, what do those things do? When you pick a sentence out of context that somebody else said, and that becomes a headline, and that's all you're looking at, what does it do? It creates an immediate emotional response.
And that's what it's designed to do. Because the more emotional you remain, the more anger we have, the more fear of each other we have, the more knee-jerk reaction we have, the easier we are to control. That's the game. And we need to start recognizing the game. And we need to start saying, no more. We're not going to do this anymore. This is done. This is over. And this is the model for how to end it. More political parties. In the old days, the women were like the Supreme Court. So you had your 50 lawmakers making the laws. You had your 50 clan mothers listening in the back to these laws, and they had the power to reject a law only if it would upset the great peace. You couldn't object to the law on any other basis, which is supposed to be how our Supreme Court works. But even they don't come to consensus. We have nowhere in our government, and I will repeat this, I believe I've said this before, Thomas Jefferson wanted us to have consensus. Benjamin Franklin thought we should have 3 presidents. So I think that there are that these ideas need to be talked about again. We need to start talking about this, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this and we're doing this. But I also think right now it is important to go into the character qualities of leaders, both male leaders, the Lo Yane, the man of the good who's making the law, the Yogo Yane, the clan mother who's running the villages and calling the women together.
So the women are looking for these qualities from the time that a boy is growing up. So the women are the logical ones to find this, since they're observing not so much what the boys say, but how they act around other boys their own age, their peers. So they're going to be able to select through their actions who has the following qualities. So number one is that he is a family man. And they define a family man as somebody who is from a proper clan, meaning that his father was from one clan, his mother was from a different clan. He's married.
And he's in the clan of his mother.
He's in the clan of his mother, exactly. So he is in a proper clan. He's married, he's never been divorced, and he has a minimum of 3 children, meaning that he's contributing to the building of the community.
Right.
Number 2, he never lied or cheated or stole anything ever in his life. Number 3, he's a man of peace who has never acted in violence either through his words or through his actions.
Right.
Number 4 is that he has skin 7 layers thick, which means that he's not the kind of man who will immediately respond in anger if somebody says something that's critical of him.
Right.
It's important for him as a leader to be able to let those words just go.
And I always love the way Tom says that somebody can come up and punch you in the face and you cannot hit back. If you do hit back, even though somebody threw the first punch, you're out. The clan mother will throw you out of office.
Number 5, exactly. Number 5 is that he's a humble man. He never brags about how he's better than everybody else. I mean, if anything, he's supposed to be for the people, not above the people.
Right. As we're watching him grow up, and in the old days, they did also. I know clan mothers. I think they're trying to get back to this. I'll have to ask Tom Porter when he's on. But I know he talks about how in the old days the clan mothers were chosen in the same way for these same character qualities.
He is kind in the way that he treats other people. He's generous. So as a leader, he'll, if anything, be poor, because when he's the kind of man in the community that when somebody else needs it, they go to him. And
Right.
he's the kind of man that gives it to them.
Right.
Number 8, he's respectful toward other people. Number 9, he's a responsible member of the community. And number 10, which of course is always my favorite, he never campaigned.
Right.
Which means that
Me too.
if he ever once went around and said to everybody or to anybody, I want to be a leader, make me the leader. If he ever said that, they'd never make him the leader, because their belief is that there's only one kind of man who wants that kind of power over others, and that's a man with a mental illness. And they didn't want somebody with a mental illness to run their country.
Exactly. And that's why you should look at actions. Somebody who wants power over others, eventually I'll find the quote next week, guys, but there's eventually a person like that is going to always put himself or herself before others. When they're looking at these children grow up, they're looking for the helpers. They're looking for the people that aren't considering what's best for them, that are putting their people first. And if the clan mother kicks them out of office, 3 strikes, you're out. And this is a system where if you are not putting your people before yourself, if you start becoming selfish, you can be thrown out. So these character qualities that we're watching of being peaceful, kind, respectful, responsible, honest, unselfish, humble, open-minded, willing to compromise, never asked for power. That is extremely important. And the family man aspect, the family woman aspect, today our families look different. That doesn't mean we can't apply that. It doesn't mean that we can't find people who are loving and who are kind and who put people in their communities first, who are doing community services, maybe even if they don't have children. It's important to understand cultural context in everything that we talk about. So when we're talking about the literal voice of the great law of peace, what we're telling you right now is like all great wisdom teachings, there are many levels on which it can be interpreted. And it's important to look at all of those levels. And the beauty of an oral tradition and the beauty of being raised in a tradition where you do have discussions about important things and important ideas that are essential to the life of everyone, to the life of the planet, is that you are trained to listen to what somebody else has to say. You are trained to truly show them that level of respect. And if you are a leader who does not show that level of respect, you are thrown out. And then unanimously, your clan will choose a new leader. To this day, among them, yes, that happens. Only the women are choosing a new leader. But I truly believe in this country, we could at least get back to 60-40. We could at least get back to, or start there, get back to where we have a much more rigorous sense of how we are picking our representatives, of how we are choosing these people.
Well, we could also have a recipe for how to do that.
Exactly.
As opposed to what do we base it on? The negative ads
Yes.
on television that tell us what horrible things the other guy did.
And
we don't have a checklist of qualities that
No.
tells us what would make a good leader.
That's exactly it. That is so true. And this is why, as I talk about being asked to run and all of the things that I've mentioned in running previously, campaign finance reform. All of the rest is smoke and mirrors. We have to get money out of government. We have to. And it can't be, and what's happening now as I talk about this to people is I hear a lot of, oh, you'll never do that. Why? Why can we never do that? It's a constitutional amendment that says that, no, you can't contribute. People are going to run. We're going to put on free ads there. The thing is that because we're not sitting down talking and because we're stuck does that mean if I let go of the NRA, does that mean I have to also let go of my pack, of my people that want gun control or, whatever it is? If, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want to let go of my folks because I'm right and they're wrong. It's like we say all the time to the kids. What are all arguments about? I'm right. No, I'm right. No, I'm right. I'm right. We have to get past that. We're grown-ups. We have to get past that level of immaturity. And let me tell you, if kids can do this activity where they can make laws unanimously and they can decide on leaders unanimously, we need to look for a way as adults to do that. Because right now, I think the little children are leading us, and that should be our clue and our cue that we need to move forward with these ideas. And we will in January when we have Kay Olin back with us for the first time, not back with us, and when we are so fortunate to have Tom Porter at least for one show and possibly two shows. He is the Mohawk spiritual leader, and like I said earlier, one of the experts on the Great Law of Peace itself. So that brings us close to the end of our day, our session together. I just want to turn it back to you, Bob, and see if there's anything else you wanted to add in about this beautiful, inspired democracy that is the Haudenosaunee democracy.
Well, it illustrates a couple of points. I mean, it illustrates how brilliant this indigenous wisdom is, which to me is an important lesson because we live in a world where ethnocentrism rules, that we've got to be the best because we're from the Western modern world. So the idea that a group of what were called at the time savages could come up with these incredible ideas of democracy is important today.
Absolutely.
And I think that's important for us to remember. And it also talks to ideas of personal responsibility. It talks to the idea of unity. It talks to the strength of men doing the things that men do best and the strength of women in doing the things that women do best. So these little germs of wisdom are things that we can, if we're careful, we can use them to make our way through the modern world. So that's what
Absolutely.
I'd like to leave us with today.
And that's a beautiful thought. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here again. And we'll see you back, I'm sure, in the new
pleasure.
year. And thank you again, Bobby, so much, my wonderful producer, Bobby Lacera. Thank you very, very much. And thank you all who are listening. I really appreciate this. Next week, we will have Morgan Jamie Dunbar talking about her personal experiences with the loss of her first child. We'll also have Marianne Francisi, who's going to join in with that discussion. We're going to talk about grief and grieving and injustice. So I know it's not quite the happy topic, but I think that it will lead us to a happiness and a peace. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and have a wonderful, wonderful week.